So now that we can reach out and touch and press our button, we want the button to move back and forth as we press it. So we want to animate the button essentially. We do this by adding a component called a touchable button component, and that's under the touchables folder underneath scripts. And we can create an empty game object first. Let's call it touchable. And we'll just put it under our button folder there so it's nice and tidy. And then we'll add the touchable button component. There we go. So I realize it's probably a little bit confusing at this stage because we've got our button here, which is essentially a button model, and the whole thing we're calling a button. Then we've got this button touchable, which moves the button model, and then we've also got the button input, which is the Unity button that we're pressing, which is fire 1. So it might be a little bit confusing. So we'll go into this touchable component, and this is what actually animates our button, and on top of that it also plays the click sounds or the movement sounds, and it also has its own event system. So when the button does move, that can trigger something to happen, such as a light turning on and off again depending on the position of the button. So the first thing we have to do is select what the actual button transform is. So that's this little cylinder here. So we'll drag and drop that in. And then we have to select which way we want the button to move. So we want it to move inwards, which would normally be the Z position, but because this was made originally with a cylinder that went up and down, and I've rotated it, which we can see here, it's the whole button box is rotated. So it's actually going to be the Y that we want it to move on. So this all depends on how your model's set up. Hopefully if you've bought some models off the store, they're actually set up in the right direction. But it doesn't really matter. If it doesn't work on one of the axes, then try the other one and it'll be one of the three anyway. So we can get a pretty good idea of how to move it just by looking at the current component. So this cylinder is currently moved in a direction of positive 0.4, and if we move it downwards we can see it goes back to 0. So we probably want pressed position to be something like maybe 1.7, so that looks pretty good. So I'll just move it back to 0.4, and then we'll put 0.17 in there. So this press section is what happens when we're pressing our mouse down or our controller button. Now we can assign a audio clip for the clicking sound, and there's one here conveniently called button press, so let's use that one. Set the volume, I'll just leave that as default right now. So the button touchable actually has 3 positions: button pressed, button in, and button out. And you only really need to use button in if it's like a toggle button. But seeing as we're not going to use a toggle for this one, we're just going to be using the button press section and the button out section. So we press the button, and then as soon as we let go, it'll pop out and trigger whatever's in this button out section. So we can put the button out to 0.4 because that's what the button currently is, and we'll select the button out sound, and that's pretty much it for the button touchable component. So now that this is set up, we need to make our input run these actions, so that way when we use our button input, when we press fire 1, we want the touchable button to move to this press position, and then when we let go of fire 1, we want the touchable button to go back to the out position. So we do that through the button input component, and as you can see there's a field here for events, so we'll add in a new function or method, and we'll drag in our button touchable, and then from the drop down box that lets us go into the button touchable component, and there's a whole bunch of methods we can run here. So we want to use the press button method, seeing as that's what's going to happen. We're pressing our mouse button, and we want the mouse button to trigger the button press method on the button touchable component. And then when we release our mouse button, we want the button touchable to also be released, so we'll drag in our touchable into this one here, button touchable menu, and we want release button. And it's as simple as that. So let's play the scene and see if that's going to move our button. So as we hold the left mouse button down, the button touchable also is pressed down, and then when we let go of our mouse button, the button touchable also gets let go in the game. Now you might notice up the top in the scene view that our thumb is no longer touching the button, and that's because our button's moving in and out, but our thumb does not. It stays where it was where we set it. So the trick there is to get the pressed position. Actually, we can move both the pressed position and the ready position and make them as children of the button model, and that way, as this button model, the cylinder, as that moves back and forth, it'll also move these two positions, the ready position and the press position, back and forth with it. So there we go. So now the thumb is always on the button no matter where it is.